worker breathes, asbestos fibers enter the mouth and nose and flow down the air passages deep into the lungs. The fibers lodge in the delicate lung tissue where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells try and break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more fibers embed in the lungs. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working. Since the year 2000, more workers have died from asbestos disease than any other workplace injury.
Mesothelioma is a rare form of cancer that lines a person's organs and is the result of lead paint and asbestos exposure and rarely radiation exposure. Smoking does not cause mesothelioma. Throughout the 20th century, millions of tons of asbestos were mined in our country and put in thousands of products. Asbestos was very inexpensive and was used as a filler in cements, drywall muds, brake and clutch linings, roof shingles, gaskets, flooring products, paints, textiles, and insulation. The companies that used asbestos knew as early as 1925 that asbestos was dangerous to the workers, to their families, and to the public. The companies commissioned medical studies that revealed these dangers, but these same companies chose profits over safety and hid these studies. They provided no warnings about the dangers, and as a result, thousands of Americans have been killed by asbestos. Sadly, in the United States, asbestos use increased dramatically as other properties of asbestos were recognized. For example, asbestos was used as a filler in many plastics and adhesives on tiles. Asbestos was used in paper production in order to obtain a higher grade of paper with a lower grade of pulp. Immediately before and after World War II, brakes, clutches, building plasters, cements, shingles, insulation, drywall, joint compounds, and textured paints commonly contained asbestos. In the United States in 1917, Dr. Henry K. Pancoast of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine observed lung scarring in the X-rays of 15 asbestos factory workers. In 1918, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics published a report by an insurance statistician noting the unusually early deaths of asbestos workers and revealing that it had become a common practice for insurers to deny coverage for workers because of the assumed health injurious conditions in the asbestos industry. By the 1930s, asbestos manufacturers and their insurance companies knew that asbestos was killing workers at alarming rates. In 1934, Aetna Insurance Company published the Attorney's Textbook of Medicine, which devoted a full chapter to asbestos exposure, noting that asbestosis was incurable and usually results in permanent disability followed by death. In the book, Outrageous Misconduct: The Asbestos Industry on Trial, the author showed that nothing proves the culpability of the asbestos manufacturers in the death and injury of asbestos workers quite like internal documents from the companies themselves. These papers, just a handful of which are shown here for the first time on national television, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the companies and their insurers knew the hazards of asbestos and concealed this information from workers for decades. More than any other piece of evidence, it is the company's own internal papers that have convinced juries of citizens across the country that workers and their families deserve compensation to help them manage the severe and often fatal health consequences of working with asbestos. The push by defendant industries to establish a national asbestos victims trust fund was driven in large part by the fact that courts consistently find asbestos companies guilty, not just of exposing their workers to a substance, asbestos, that could kill or severely injure them, but of doing this with full knowledge of the fatal consequences of their actions, and of actively concealing this truth from these same workers. I quote, "The 1966 documents of the Director of Purchasing for Bendix Corporation, now a part of Honeywell, which capture the complete disregard of an industry for its workforce that is expressed over and over again in company documents spanning the past 60 years. If you have enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?" In court cases after court cases, insurance and manufacturing company documents were made public through litigation. These papers reveal a brazen disregard for the men and women who by the 1960s were dying by the thousands each year for these businesses, a history of abuse and deception that is unparalleled in American industrial history. In large measure, it is the written words of these company executives that have convinced juries across America those workers and their families deserve full compensation for their suffering. In 1980, the American Insurance Association predicted that there will be between 8,000 and 13,000 claims a year from asbestos-caused cancer from 1977 through 1995. In 1968, the Travelers Insurance Company concluded that they faced major financial exposure from deaths due to non-occupational asbestos exposure near asbestos manufacturing facilities. That conclusion was confirmed when a Manville attorney informed the Travelers that, confidentially, Johns Manville has been contaminating the hell out of both the water and the air for quite some time. Dr. Smith, medical director of Johns Manville, explained the corporate politics in the following words, and I quote, "It is felt that as long as the man feels well, is happy at home and at work, and his physical condition remains good, nothing should be said. When he becomes disabled and sick, then the diagnosis should be made in the claims submitted by the company. The fibrosis of this disease is irreversible and permanent, so that eventually compensation will be paid to each of these men. But as long as the man is not disabled, it is felt that he should not be told of his condition so that he can live and work in peace and the company can benefit by his many years of experience." Van Diver Brown, former general counsel of Johns Manville Legal Department, summarized this even further when asked the following question, "Mr. Brown, do you mean to tell me that you would let them work until they drop dead?" "Yes, we save a lot of money that way." A 1974 memo from Exxon declares, "Not only are we violating the existing regulations concerning clothing by not providing such clothing and laundering it, but we are also failing to protect our employees and the families of our employees from asbestos exposure." The goal of the Travelers Catastrophic Products Committee was to study the potential for asbestos to wipe out the company's assets, and then, in the company's own words, make the catastrophe reducible to a level which would not imperil the assets of travelers. The question was how to do it. The decision on the part of the insurers was to adopt the same strategy as producers, deny prior knowledge and admit no liability. In 1977, the insurance industry's discussion group on asbestosis unanimously decided not to admit liability in asbestosis cases. And I quote from their own documents, "The meeting closed with a unanimous rejection of a suggestion that liability in asbestosis cases be admitted." In a 1970 W.R. Grace memo regarding sales of its monocoat fireproofing spray product, which contained 12% asbestos, an employee urged, "Stay unscrupulous, unethical, mean, and selling monocoat." A 1972 Union Carbide memorandum instructed managers to handle inquiries from concerned customers aggressively, and I quote, "If the customer is persistent and threatens to eliminate asbestos, a certain amount of aggressiveness may be effective." Words and catchphrases such as premature, irrational, or avoiding the inevitable will sometimes turn the table. The main objective is to keep the customer on the defensive, make him justify his position. A 1981 Dow internal memo marked confidential had the following note scrawled across the top by a worried executive. We are in trouble and would be more so if we had an investigation. We need a crash program. In this insider exclusive investigative TV special, we go behind the headlines in Mesothelioma, Robert Grimes' story, to examine how Ron Shingler, partner at Shingler Law, successfully settled Robert Grimes' mesothelioma case. Bob Grimes was diagnosed with mesothelioma January 18, 2008. He was told he had 1 year, perhaps 18 months to live. He and his wife Lori were devastated by this news. Bob was exposed to asbestos in the U.S. Navy and while working as a school custodian in Antioch, California. Bob Grimes is just one of thousands upon thousands of men who have suffered this same ordeal. In this insider exclusive special, Bob will tell you his story of how he started to feel ill and how he didn't know why. He will tell you how he hoped it was the flu, but it wasn't. He will tell you about the fear he felt as he waited for the diagnosis he hoped would never be made. He will tell you how he and Lori cried themselves to sleep that night and how hard it was for him to tell his children and friends. Today, Ron Shingler and fellow lawyer Rick Brody will discuss the 5 biggest misconceptions about your legal rights in mesothelioma lawsuits. Ron has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best asbestos lawyers in California and in the nation. He has seen many innocent and hardworking people become victims of intentional corporate wrongdoing. And because of that, he is driven to fight for people who have been harmed by the willful or negligent actions of others. His goals, not only to get justice for his clients, but to make sure that corporations respect and protect the health and the safety of all workers, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and justice and power must be brought together so that whatever is just may be powerful, and whatever is powerful may be just. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Antioch, California. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ron Shingler and Rick Brody to the show. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Ron, tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What are your typical cases that you handle?
We do primarily mesothelioma cases. We do only asbestos cases, some asbestosis, some lung cancer cases, primarily mesothelioma cases.
Mm-hmm. And Rick, you have done, you're of counsel to the firm, and you've also done a lot of asbestos cases over the years, right?
Yes, many cases for injured people over the years.
When you initially contacted us, Ron, and you were telling the story of the case that we're going to be discussing today, Bob Grimes, you told me a rather interesting story about yourself, about why you handle these kinds of cases. Your dad was an asbestos worker, wasn't he?
That's right, Steve. When I was back in high school, I began having these inklings of a notion that I might want to be an attorney someday. And my father worked out at the Johns Manville plant in Pittsburgh, California, where they made asbestos-containing products, roofing products, shingle products, siding products, and so forth, all asbestos products. And as I was growing up, I would hear my parents talking about different co-workers of my father who had retired and then passed away. And it was something of a mystery to them. Why were these people retiring and then dying? As time went by, I came to find out why. They had been heavily exposed to asbestos, and as a consequence of that exposure, they were developing diseases like lung cancer, asbestosis, and mesothelioma. I remember seeing my mother sitting in the living room crying when she would find out that yet another one of my father's co-workers had passed away. She, of course, sad over the death, but fearful over what might happen to my own father. And then I learned that Johns Manville had known of the hazards of asbestos since the early 1930s. Said another way, they knew of the hazards of asbestos before my father was even born.
Yeah.
Yet they concealed that, and knowingly exposed him to a product that ultimately, put his life at great risk. He himself developed asbestosis. In those early days, I thought, now I know what I want to do. I've wanted to be a lawyer.
So you could go after these people.
I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and I wanted to represent men. I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer and that I would represent men like my father. I would represent families like my family. Mm-hmm. And I chose to make that my career, and that's been my career.
And thank God for that, because Bob Grimes today, when we bring him on, has benefited from your experience. We did a lot of research and found all of these internal documents that all these companies were aware of, and they just didn't give a damn. That was plain and simple. For our audience, in real simple terms, what is the disease called mesothelioma?
Mesothelioma is a cancer of the lining of the lung. Oma means tumor. The mesothelium is the lining of the lung. It is that space outside the lung where the lung meets against the chest wall. So there's this very thin membrane. That membrane, the mesothelium, when it becomes cancerous, they call it mesothelioma, so a cancer of the lining of the lung.
What are some of the symptoms and the signs of mesothelioma?
A man will develop shortness of breath. He'll go to his doctor, not sure why he's short of breath. He'll assume that it's because he's a little overweight. He'll assume it's because he hasn't exercised enough.
Right.
The doctor will determine that there's a buildup of fluid in the space between his lung and the chest wall that's compressing the lung. Yeah. He can't fully expand the lung, and they drain off that fluid, and they'll test that to see if they can find any mesothelioma cells.
Rick, who are the people that are most likely to get mesothelioma?
Generally speaking, Steve, it's people who've worked with asbestos, factory workers, construction workers, longshoremen, mechanics. The tragic thing with mesothelioma, though, is that people who were only incidentally exposed can get this disease. Spouses who wash their husband's work clothes. Yeah. People who are present at family-owned laundries.
Because they get the fibers.
They get the fibers.
Go into their lungs.
The fibers don't care what someone's job is. They go everywhere.
Equal opportunity killers, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about Bob Grimes' case. You and Bob share some commonality. You're both from Antioch, California, right?
Yes, that's true. I grew up in Antioch, and I attended Antioch High School. And back in those days, I was the president of Antioch High School. At the same time, Bob Grimes was working as a custodian at Antioch High School. I have vague memories of him there back at that time. Bob also grew up in Antioch and graduated from Antioch High School.
Mm-hmm. When Bob originally came to you and you started representing him, tell our audience a little bit about some of the legal strategies and challenges you had in this kind of a case that would be typical of many type of cases like this.
The first question is, does the man have mesothelioma? Mm-hmm. Well, he had just come directly from the office of his oncologist, and the oncologist had told him that he had mesothelioma, and he was there with his wife and his son to see what legal recourse he might have. He was there on the recommendation of his oncologist.
They also told him that he had maybe, at the outmost, a year to a year and a half left to live, correct?
They told him that, and they told him to go home and get his affairs in order.
Yeah.
I remember sitting there with Bob. He was in shock. He just stared at me as I explained things to his son, and I began thinking of the challenges that I would face in the case. Chief among them would be demonstrating how he was exposed to asbestos.
Yeah, which brings us to what your main target was in this case. It was a floor tile manufacturer, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. There was a company by the name of Tile, and we had to establish that Tile's products were present throughout the Antioch Unified School District. We were able to establish that, and then further established through the medical literature and industrial hygiene literature that people are indeed exposed to asbestos from floor tiles,
Yeah.
particularly custodians who work in high schools, and we found that evidence.
And that is because they're working with the tile all the time, polishing it, right?
It's the process of installing it, it's
Yeah.
the process of replacing it, of stripping the wax, buffing the floors. All of those operations cause fibers to be released.
As a result of this case and other cases like it, we hope society changes a little bit, have the manufacturers change the composition of their tile floors.
Actually, Tile changed their composition, and most of the floor tile industry changed the composition of their tile products back in the mid-1980s.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a major step forward, isn't it? Today we're fortunate enough to have Bob and Lori here with us, so we're going to bring them on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bob and Lori Grimes to the show. Welcome to the show.
Okay.
Boy, what an ordeal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Take us back to the day you first heard from the doctor that you had mesothelioma. What did it feel like?
It was pretty devastating. When the doctor tells you you have 12 to 16 months to live and you're a year away from retirement, that can be pretty devastating, to say the least.
Yeah. And were you with him at the doctor when this happened?
As soon as they said the word mesothelioma.
Did you know what it was? You
Yes, because we've always worked in the industry,
did? Yeah.
and we were devastated because we're young.
Yeah. How did you work through the emotion of God? You know, and by the way, I'm happy to report that that diagnosis took place, what, 4.5 years ago?
Almost 5 in December.
Almost 5 years ago. So you have outlived, and you look.
And we're very
healthy.
grateful for every
Yeah.
day
How
of
did,
it.
How did you had to tell your family, right? Mm-hmm. What was that like, Lori?
It wasn't easy. Our daughter moved back to California, and our son was with us when we met Ron, and the families. It made us even tighter than we were.
You now know that exposure to asbestos products caused this.
Yes.
Not only in the Navy, but also working as a custodian at the school.
Yes.
You're on national TV now. What do you have to say to the manufacturers that created these products?
Well, they knew years ago, and they should have started much earlier in the process of eliminating the asbestos from all their products.
They chose not to, you know that.
They chose not to. Most of the major companies, some that were litigated against, filed bankruptcy and then turned around and regrouped, and they were doing the exact same
They're
thing,
going strong.
using the same products.
Yeah, they have a total disregard for human life, don't they? Lori?
They too.
They don't care as long as they're making money, right?
It's
Yes.
the profit line.
Yeah. What is your life like today?
Well, we both. I retired when I was 50, hoping he would hurry up and retire, and I was afraid that something would happen, and it did. And so now he's no longer working, so we hang out and go to the doctor visits. And
Right. And you say you go to the doctor, you go get checkups.
I get checkups. I still do.
he's in chemo.
I still do chemotherapy periodically,
Do you? How often do you do that?
maybe once a year.
Really?
I'll go through a cycle.
How it's changed your perspective on the value of life, hasn't it?
Very much.
You appreciate every day.
Definitely learn to separate the wheat from the chaff real quick.
There are a lot of people who are watching this show that may be suffering from mesothelioma or think they have it. What do you recommend that they do, Bob?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to accept the doctor's diagnosis, but you don't have to accept the prognosis. Second opinions are always good. They'll tell you, they'll give you the statistics. The standard median life expectancy after diagnosis is 12 to 16 months. Well, there's a lot of room on either end for that. I was fortunate, I was in good health, fairly young. after my diagnosis, I went home and laid in bed for about 2 weeks and figured this was the end. And then I got really, really upset. I said, this is not right. You know, there are other things that I can do to beat this. So with my friends and family, my daughter in particular, Shannon, we searched the internet. We talked to people, read books by people who had survived, guys like Rio O'Connor, who was a representative by Ron. I had the pleasure of talking to Rio and got his perspective. Now, you can go traditional medicine, you can go complementary, or you can go alternative. Traditional being your usual radiation therapy, chemotherapy, or surgery. Complementary, which I have been doing, is a mixture. You can do the chemotherapy, and then while you're not doing the chemotherapy, which is most of the time, I go to an herbalist, have an acupuncturist. There are vitamins.
It's a lot of things you can do.
There's a million things that you can do you can't beat it, but you can prolong it and put it off for a long, long time.
And simultaneously, there are your legal rights that you need to pursue.
Exactly.
Would you were represented by Ron in this case. They settled
Right
it
away.
successfully.
Yes.
As soon as we heard the word mesothelioma, we knew this is illegal as heck.
Right.
And we told our son, and he knew someone in his office that knew Ron Shingler. And right away I called here to find out where we are on this thing, and we had a case that we could proceed with, which has helped with the alternative medicines, because your insurance doesn't pay for that, and it's not cheap.
Yeah, but it helps to have a law firm that's experienced in this area.
Absolutely.
In every way.
Yeah, because they know what's going on.
Exactly.
And
It was
they-
perfect.
And they know, I like to call it the dirty tricks.
I
That
call
not only the Defense Council uses, but also these companies, because they deny everything, right?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Well, we're glad to see you today. 5 years. Wow. That's
Glad to be here.
tremendous. And we are very happy that you were on the show today. You give a lot of people inspiration.
He gives a lot of people inspiration.
Yeah, give them inspiration to go on, that you can beat it.
Sure.
And you do have legal rights, and you should pursue them. And I want to thank you very much for being on the program, both of you. You know, Ron and Rick, there are many questions that people have who have been diagnosed with mesothelioma. And I'm just going to ask you, if you are diagnosed, do you need a lawyer? And how should you determine what lawyer to use?
If you're diagnosed, you need a lawyer. And I'm right here. Call me. This is what I do. I've done it for 24 years. People call me. If I can help them, I take their case and I help them.
Right.
If they're in Kansas, I'll find the lawyer in Kansas who can help them.
Right.
That's what we do.
Rick, what if you can't remember where you were exposed to asbestos? Can you sue?
Absolutely. Most people don't remember and don't know every product they were exposed to. It's the job of a good, experienced lawyer to meet with people, and we meet with people over and over, and we take them back in history and put them into their jobs so that they can remember what they did and what was around them.
Right.
But yes, they can sue.
In Bob's case, in Bob Grimes' case, he was in the military, he was exposed to asbestos. If you were exposed to asbestos in the military, can you sue them?
You cannot sue the military, but you can sue the companies and the manufacturers of the products that
the
were
military
supplied,
used?
That the military used.
Really?
Yes.
So you still have an avenue to seek remedies?
Yes.
What factors determined compensation in mesothelioma cases?
First and foremost is the pain and suffering that people have. This is a very serious disease, and unfortunately not as many people do as well as Bob Grimes does. Juries look at that. They look at the harm not only to the person but to their spouse, to their family, the loss of support, the complete upheaval in their lives. So all those things figure in.
I just want to add one thing to that. That obviously a young man who's making a lot of money, his case has a higher value. But we recently took the case of a 96-year-old man who lawyers would turn away, saying he's way outlived his life expectancy. It so happened that he was a Johns Manville plant worker, and I don't turn plant workers away. But we look at the dignity of a human life, and it's been offended by what's happened when they're exposed to this product and develop a disease when it could have been prevented.
Just curious, is that case still ongoing?
That gentleman passed away 2 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and we are filing a wrongful death case on behalf of his wife, who is 92 years old.
Wow, very good. Is there a deadline for filing mesothelioma cases?
In California, yes, there is. There's a statute of limitations, but essentially it's 1 year from the date of diagnosis or 1 year from the date that you had to take a disability retirement. In some respects, there is no statute of limitations. The best thing to do is to call a lawyer and let a lawyer tell you. If you have the disease, seek legal advice.
Probably the most important question, because a lot of people, when they think lawyers, it's going to cost me a lot of money. Is hiring a mesothelioma lawyer expensive?
It can be when you talk about the contingency fee, but when you come into the office, to our office, and to most every lawyer who does this line of work, there is no expense that you have to pay up front. If the lawyer makes money for you, he makes money for himself. If he doesn't make money for you, he doesn't make money for himself.
So it doesn't cost a person anything unless the case is successfully settled or won, right?
Correct.
Okay, I want to thank both of you for being on this program, because you have explained a lot that a lot of people today who are suffering from diseases like that have a recourse, have a place to go right now. And thank you very much for being on our program.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.